My name is Roberto. I'm 72 years old, and I lived for almost half a century in the same house, with the same wooden windows I installed myself during the first summer after I finished building it. I say building it because that's exactly what I did. Stone by stone, nail by nail. It was the kind of home that carries sweat in the walls and memory in the foundations. I buried my youth there. I watched my son grow up running across the porch. I watched my wife die silently in the front room, no drama. Just a quiet departure that left the void never fully healed. That's why, when my son came to me and said he had met a different kind of woman and wanted to marry her, after just 4 months of dating, something inside me snapped. Not out of jealousy, I've never been a possessive man, but because his eyes spoke of urgency, and hers of calculation. Her name is Marina. Blonde, beautiful, a little too polite. She spoke slowly, as if measuring every word with a ruler, always smiling but never showing her teeth. She had a curious talent. She could compliment someone while subtly belittling them without them even realizing it. When I met her, she offered me a Chilean wine and said, "You're going to love it, despite your rustic taste." We laughed, as if it were a joke, but something about it pricked me like an invisible splinter. Within a week, she already knew how much my son earned, what assets the family had, how many payments were left on his car, and, most importantly, that the house we lived in had been paid off since the 90s. That struck me as odd, but I kept it to myself. When you grow old, you learn that your first line of defense isn't your voice, it's silence. The wedding proposal came soon after. My son walked into the house with a bouquet of flowers, a dentist-dad smile, and the words, "Dad, I'm truly happy," and I believe he was. The problem is that happiness is sometimes just an illusion with an expiration date. He said they were planning a simple wedding, just a civil ceremony to make it official. The curious thing was that Marina insisted on using my address as her official residence. At the registry office, to save money, she said, "For now, we'll stay here until we can afford our own place." I just nodded. The house was big. There was space, and even with a quiet voice inside nudging me, I chose not to interfere. I knew what the house was made of. They didn't. The days leading up to the wedding felt like a quiet rehearsal for what was to come. Marina started walking around the house with more ownership than she should have. She moved pictures around, donated some of my clothes by accident, saying they were too old, replaced the curtains my late wife had sewn by hand, claiming they smelled like the past. And my son, well, he was blind, said she was decisive, proactive, that she did everything for the good of the house. When I asked why the rush, he told me something that stuck like a thorn. "Dad, we don't live forever. I want to build the now." I thought about replying that because we don't live forever, we should think twice before handing everything over to someone who just arrived. But I didn't. I just looked at him and let him learn the hard way. The wedding took place on a Saturday afternoon. No party, no ceremony. Just a legal bid and an awkward lunch in the backyard. Marina was glowing, but not out of love, out of control. I could tell by the way she held my son's arm, like saying he's mine. During the toasts, she thanked our homes plural, but there was only one house, mine. During the meal, I noticed her whispering in his ear. It was as if she were slowly erasing me, making my presence irrelevant in the face of this supposed new family structure. But I didn't feel anger, just a strange weariness, an old fatigue, as if my story were being rewritten by hands that didn't even know where the foundation lay. That night, I sat on the porch and stayed there late, listening to the crickets, their footsteps in the hallway, Marina's muffled laughter. Something told me I no longer lived in my own house. I was merely a tolerated guest. I didn't yet know how or when, but I sensed that this rushed marriage wasn't really about love. It was about possession. And once you understand that, The only thing you should hurry is your preparation for what comes next. The first days after the wedding were filled with a suffocating routine. Marina started waking up before everyone else, opening windows as if she were trying to air out more than just the room, perhaps the past that I still represented. My son left early for work, and when he came home, the house was already rearranged, furniture in different places, curtains changed again, interior doors now with new locks. Every small detail revealed something he didn't see. The house was no longer a home. It was becoming territory. I kept my habit of fixing small things. The fridge was already showing signs of fatigue, and the bedroom door hinges creaked as if they were complaining along with me. One afternoon, while I was kneeling behind the fridge, checking the wiring, I heard the question. It came without warning, sharp as a blow. "Mr. Jewel, when you're gone, this house goes to Rodrigo, right? Like, it's in his name." The voice came from Marina, leaning against the doorframe like someone who had already claimed the entrance. I stood up slowly, looked at her with the calm that only age knows how to give. She smiled, but something in her eyes betrayed her an underlying urgency, a hunger in disguise. I answered in a way she didn't expect. "The deed has 3 names, mine, my late wife's, and my conscience. Only it knows what will be done." She frowned slightly, still smiling but clearly uncomfortable. Said she was just curious. After all, Rodrigo's not into legal stuff, documents and all. I nodded in silence. I knew exactly what she wanted. Legal security disguised as politeness. That night, I heard whispers from their room. Muffled words, but a few made it through the wall. "Yeah, but what if he changes his mind? We need to make sure." I woke up earlier than usual the next morning, went to my old hardwood wardrobe and pulled out a folder with documents. The deed was there, in my name, notarized, sealed, certified. No will, no donation, no shared ownership. It was mine, entirely mine. I knew that. But it was time to remind myself and to make clear that any attempt to erase me would take more than a sweet smile and a civil marriage. In the days that followed, Marina started watching me more closely. She brought me coffee, asked how I was feeling, handed me the newspaper at lunch. All too much. It wasn't care, it was reconnaissance. She wanted to know my schedule, my moods, my weaknesses. As if I were an obstacle she hadn't yet figured out how to get around. An obstacle made of flesh, bone, and a deed. One night, she brought the subject up again, this time with my son present. She said, as if commenting on the weather, "This house is way too big for just one person, right, Rodrigo? Imagine when it's ours we could renovate everything. Maybe even sell it and buy something more modern." Rodrigo laughed, scratched his head, didn't answer, but his silence said it all. He didn't disagree. He didn't defend. He didn't say, "The house belongs to my father." None of that. He just smiled, complicit and passive. That's when I knew. He was also beginning to see the house not as an inheritance, but as a wedding prize. That was also when the visits started showing up. A real estate agent came by one morning, saying she was just getting to know the neighborhood. An architect knocked at the door saying Marina had referred him. She tried to play it down. "Oh, honey, it's just to get some renovation ideas. No need to worry, Mr. Jewel." But I did worry, because I knew how to read between the lines. And more than anything, I knew what was mine. That same afternoon, I reinforced the lock on my bedroom door, made digital copies of the documents, emailed them to myself and to an old lawyer who used to say, "If Mrs. Marina wants to renovate the house, she can start by signing a lease," because that's exactly what she was, a tenant. A tenant trying to become the owner by way of a wedding ring and emotional blackmail. But I wasn't just any old man. I was the one who built that house. And if one day they tried to force me out, they would have no idea what was hidden in the walls, in the paperwork, in the fine print. Because no matter how much they underestimated me for walking slowly, I was still the one holding the foundations of that house together. Literally, it was an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. I was on my knees in the kitchen, taking apart the back of the fridge, trying to figure out why the motor had been vibrating like a trapped cat. Sweat dripped down my temples, and my shirt was already damp when I heard the sound of sharp heels echoing through the house. Firm and calculated, Marina walked in first, dressed like someone headed to a notary's office, beige blouse, hair tied back with surgical precision. Behind her, a short man in a suit carried a black folder under his arm and wore the expression of someone who had already won before the game even started. She cleared her throat. I didn't turn around right away. I kept fiddling with the compressor for a few more seconds until the lawyer, impatient, stepped forward. "Good afternoon, Mer.Juo. We're here to inform you, formally, that the property you're living in has been sold." I said nothing. My hand remained steady, turning the screwdriver slowly, as if the humming of the appliance was more urgent than any document in the world. "Your son Rodrigo and his wife, Mrs. Marina, signed the papers this week. The sale is finalized. The new owner is expected to take possession in 30 days. And, well, we'll need you to vacate the premises." That's when I finally turned around. I stood up slowly, wiped my hands on an old cloth, and looked at them. Marina was smiling, but the smile felt more like a flag being planted than any act of kindness. I looked at her first, then at the lawyer, and then I let out a short laugh. Not of despair, not of mockery, just a laugh, like when a child says they've bought the moon. I turned back to the fridge, tightened one of the screws, and simply said, "It'll run better now." The lawyer seemed confused. "Marina thought I was losing it, Mr. Juo. This is serious. Everything is legal. We have the power of attorney signed by Rodrigo, notarized." I just shook my head, like someone listening to a customer describe a problem with the wrong appliance. What I wanted to fix wasn't the fridge. It was time, and I knew mine was still intact. They kept pushing, opened the folder, showed me documents, tried to explain clauses, figures, registry dates, said they had sold the house for a good price and were going to buy an apartment downtown. "We'll take care of you, of course," Marina said, in a voice that sounded rehearsed in front of a mirror. "But here, it's just not working anymore. It's a new phase, you know. You've had a good life here. It's time for a change." I stared at them for a while. They didn't know. They really had no idea. They didn't imagine that the house deed was kept in an old safe in my bedroom, behind 2 locks, in my name and mine alone. They didn't know about the clause that prohibited any sale without my signature. They didn't know that the so-called power of attorney was a stationery store printout, not a court document. And above all, they didn't realize they were trying to evict the rightful owner from his own home, as if I were some inconvenient tenant. I pretended to read the papers, nodded like someone confused, like someone ready to give in. 30 days, is that it?" I asked, like an old man already bent by pain and age. The lawyer nodded. Marina smiled, satisfied. "It'll be good for you, Dad. A fresh start, closer to everything, more comfort, and less attachment, right?" What they didn't realize was that I was never attached to the structure of the house. What I was defending wasn't the walls, it was the story within them. Every chip in the floor had a memory of my wife. Every crack in the paint held a laugh from my son as a child. Every step on the staircase carried one of my stumbles, an end-of-day exhaustion, a silent victory after a long shift. It wasn't the house they were trying to take away. It was my dignity, my memory, my presence. When they left, with the black folder under the lawyer's arm and the echo of heels hitting the floor like a countdown, I went to my room, opened the safe, touched the documents like someone holding a talisman, and I smiled. because they didn't know they had just signed, unknowingly, their own downfall. All I had to do was wait for the right moment, and it would come. No rush. Fridge fixed. House standing. And me, sharper than ever. That same night, after the door closed with a soft click of wood touching the frame, I went to my room and sat at the edge of the bed. I heard the gate shutting and the lawyer's car reversing down the street. Marina laughed. I heard it. A laugh from someone who thinks they've won. And somehow, that brought me peace. Because that's exactly what I needed. For them to believe they had won. To think the old man was defeated. That the tired body and soft voice had submission. Little did they know what had been resting in silence for years inside a brown envelope. I opened the nightstand drawer, pushed aside some old papers, a photo of my late wife that had never left its place, and at the back, the silver key. The safe was in the built-in closet. Behind a wooden panel I had painted the same color as the shelves, an old piece of carpentry. No one noticed anymore. With a gentle push in the left corner, the panel gave way with a muted click. The key fit perfectly. The combination, etched into memory since the day I had it installed, had never slipped. 1963, the year I bought that plot of land with the savings of a lifetime. Inside the safe, everything was just as I had left it. Certificates, contracts, insurance policies. And there was the most valuable document in that house. The original deed, printed on official letterhead with a blue notary stamp. My name alone. No Rodrigo. No Marina. No living donation. No transfer. No will. That house was, by law, a part of my body. But there was more. On the last page, a clause few young people would understand the value of. A lifetime inalienability clause. An addendum that forbade the sale or transfer of the property while I was alive, unless by my express will. The notary's signature was still clear, the seals intact. I knew exactly what I held. They didn't. I took the document and sat back down on the bed, turned on the lamp and stayed there, the paper open on my lap, like someone reading an old love letter. Because, in a way, it was. That paper wasn't just a deed to the house. It was proof that I wasn't invisible, nor disposable. It was a reminder that no matter how much they tried to push me out, I was still the one who decided which door I'd walk through. I thought about calling Rodrigo right then, showing him everything, rubbing in how foolish he'd been, how easily he was being manipulated. But no. There's something more powerful than spoken truth. Truth revealed at the right moment. And that moment hadn't come yet. I had put everything back, locked the safe, slid the panel back into place, and closed the closet. The key returned to the drawer, beneath my wife's photo. I missed her in that moment. She would have seen this all coming from the first lunch with the daughter-in-law. She would have noticed how Marina looked at the living room items not as memories, but as assets. She would have laughed with me at the power of attorney they handed me earlier, and she would have asked me, as she always did, "Did you prepare your plan B, Juho?" And I would have answered, just like now, always. In the following days, I pretended everything was normal. I had my coffee on the porch, tended to the garden, swept the yard with a broom that made too much noise. Marina began walking around the house like someone who already owned it. She had the couch moved, replaced the hallway pictures, and once even complained that my tools were to spread out in the garage. I smiled. Sometimes I even thanked her for the suggestions. Rodrigo, on the other hand, seemed confused. There was something in his eyes, a mix of guilt and submission, as if he knew, deep down, that something was wrong, but didn't know how to untie the noose his wife was tightening around both their necks. I tried to look at him as a father, but it was hard not to see him as an accomplice. Marina was so sure of the sale that she even began telling the neighbors, told Mrs. Lucia next door that the house would soon be renovated. She even hired a bricklayer to measure the windows. was planning to repaint the walls and change the front gate. I watched everything. Every action she took was another line written in an invisible journal, where arrogance signed beneath every paragraph. But deep down, all of it worked in my favor, because the more she moved, the more tracks she left, and the more she exposed herself, the stronger my eventual defense became. Or better yet, my revelation. Their game was in motion, and I sat front row, deed in my pocket and a smile they mistook for senility. But soon, very soon, they would understand. Not every old man is fragile. Not every silence means surrender. And definitely, not every home can be sold with words in colored paper. There's no war more effective than the one fought in silence. And it's precisely on that battlefield that an old man, accustomed to the slowness of time, learns how to win. In the days following the lawyer's visit and the theatrical announcement of the house's sale, my strategy was simple. I let them believe everything. I pretended to be confused, defeated, resigned. One morning, I even said I'd start looking for another place. Marina smiled, as if she'd expected it all along. Rodrigo looked away, as if he knew something was wrong but didn't have the strength to even say good morning. But inside, something in me had solidified. It wasn't anger I had felt in other phases of life, back when I still thought the world needed to hear my pain. No, what I felt now was something harder, colder, clarity. And that clarity said, if they want to play with fake papers, let them face the full weight of documented truth. It all started with a detail. Marina had begun walking around the house with her phone on speaker, sometimes talking to that lawyer, other times to her sister, someone named Raquel, whom I'd never met. But in those conversations, little phrases would slip out. As soon as he leaves, we'll start the renovation, or I'll make him sign whatever. Just needs some emotional pressure. Those were the sentences I focused on. I discreetly installed an automatic recording app on my own phone, something I'd learned to do years ago, when I needed to record abuses from a shady health insurance agent. Every call I made or received was now saved to a memory card. And when Marina left her phone on the table, I also photographed open conversations. I never snooped, just took note of what was visible on the locked screen. Notifications with messages, pictures, voice notes from group chats, all stored, untouched. In the garage, my old notebook came back to life. I started logging dates, times, names. When Marina said anything about the house, I wrote it down. When Rodrigo hesitated with a response, I took note. When the bricklayer showed up to take measurements, I brought him a glass of water and asked the name of his company. That's when I found out he thought the house was already empty. Marina had told him the old owner was moving out. A life lesson. The more confident the scammer feels, the more they talk. And they talked a lot. Marina started treating me like a guest. Told me not to touch the fridge. Said my containers took up too much space. Even changed the lock on the side gate, claiming it was for the safety of the children. Children who didn't even exist. Everything was recorded. Everything was noted. As the file grew, I called an old acquaintance, Dr. Savio, a retired lawyer who still kept his office open for personal cases. I told him everything, showed him the audio files, the photos, the screenshots. He listened for almost 3 hours in silence, glasses sliding down the bridge of his nose, a cold coffee in his hand. When I finished, he simply said, "Joe, this isn't just a defense. This is attempted fraud with aggravating factors. Do you want to move forward with this?" I didn't answer with words. I just closed the binder, slid it toward him, and nodded. The answer had been written in my eyes since the day I heard the phrase, "We sold the house, you need to leave." Whoever says that to a father isn't looking for reconciliation. They're looking for profit. Dr. Savio began the proceedings, drafted an initial petition with a request for an emergency injunction. We included certified copies of the deed, the lifetime inalienability clause, the audio recordings with veiled threats, the fake documents presented by Marina, the screenshots, and the bricklayer's statement. With all that, we filed not only a preemptive possession challenge, but also a police report for identity fraud, an attempted coercion of an elder. But one ingredient was still missing: time. The legal process would move forward. Yes, but until then, I had to keep playing the role of the frail one, the defeated, the kind old father. I started pretending to pack, placed empty boxes in the living room, took books off the shelves, even asked Rodrigo if I could store some things at Marina's place for a few days. He agreed, nervously. She was euphoric. They truly believed they were in control. And it was within that illusion that the trap was set, because while they laughed upstairs and began discussing what color to paint the living room walls, the court officer had already received the judge's order. The warrant had been issued, and the knock on the door was closer than they could imagine. In the chess game of life, sometimes the most powerful move isn't the attack but the retreat. And that's exactly what I did. In the weeks that followed Marina and Rodrigo's staged performance, I let their little play unfold, as if I were merely a background actor. I came up with a casual excuse that an old friend had offered me a temporary lodging and began rehearsing my departure. They bought the performance with unsettling ease. Marina even patted me on the back and said, "Glad you understand. It's better for everyone." Rodrigo stayed quiet, not quite an accomplice, but not stopping anything either. That said everything. I began packing up objects, not the real ones, of course, but junk I kept in the storage room. Things that should have been thrown out years ago. I filled boxes with old newspapers, torn books, and clothes from when my wife was still alive. Marina didn't even notice. She was too busy sending voice messages to her sister, saying the house will finally be free, and that she'd already picked a color for the living room. Send white with a champagne hue. A bitter-tasting joke. One afternoon, during one of these packing sessions, I did something symbolic. I took down the old framed wedding photo from the living room, the one where my wife and I smiled, young and full of hope. I faked emotion, took a deep breath and said aloud, "I don't think she'd like this, but that's life." Marina heard from the hallway and smiled, like someone who had just claimed victory. Rodrigo, again, looked away. Cowardice lives in the silence of those who pretend not to see. That same night, I called Dr. Savio. He advised me to keep up the appearance of compliance for 2 more days, until the court officer had final confirmation to serve the writ. They're incriminating themselves. We just need to let them dig their own hole, he said. And that's what I did. The next day, I left with 2 fake suitcases, filled with old towels, outdated papers, and a musty pillow. I kissed Marina on the cheek. She hugged me quickly and said, "Good luck." She could barely contain her delight. Rodrigo gave me a weak handshake and only said, "Let me know if you need anything." I looked at him for 2 seconds and thought, what destroys a home isn't an ambitious woman, it's a son without a spine. I walked away, as if heading to the bus stop, but just around the corner, a car was already waiting. A trusted friend drove me straight to the lawyer's office. There, we spent the day finalizing details. The main petition had already been filed, and the injunction to freeze the property deed was under review. Marina and Rodrigo still didn't know that every document they presented was legally void. The power of attorney Marina waved around was a copy-paste template from the internet, signed with my name lifted from an old receipt. Pathetic. Not even notarized. The so-called lawyer who accompanied her was a freshly graduated classmate, acting as a front. And all of this was now part of a formal criminal investigation. That night, I slept in peace. Not in a borrowed home, as Marina believed, but in a modest flat I had rented in advance, under a discreet name. It had everything I needed: a good bed, a coffee maker, and a view of the city that reminded me how vast the world still is, even when your own family becomes a maze with no exit. Meanwhile, back in my house, Marina had already called a contractor to assess the kitchen. Rodrigo, according to our gossiping neighbor, had been telling people that the old man moved out because he couldn't handle living with young people anymore. A childish lie, but perfect to leave the rope loose enough for them to hang themselves with it. 2 days later, I woke up to a notification on my phone. The judge had granted the emergency injunction, recognizing full ownership of the property as mine, freezing any attempt at sale or renovation, and ordering a criminal investigation against Marina and her legal representative for attempted fraud, document forgery, and violations of the elderly statute. It was time to go back, but I didn't return alone. I was accompanied by 2 court officers, an unmarked police vehicle, and a local radio reporter who had received a tip from Dr. Savio. When we entered through the front gate, Marina was in the backyard, holding a measuring tape. Rodrigo appeared with a tray of paint. Time froze in that scene, and for the first time in years, they were silent. Their silence was the fairest sound the house had heard in a long time. The courtroom was cold that morning, not just from the overactive air conditioning, but from the atmosphere of silent tension hanging in the air. I sat calmly in the varnished wooden chair, reserved for claimants, while Marina fanned herself with an ivory envelope and Rodrigo stared fixedly at the floor, like someone who senses what's coming but lacks the courage to admit it. The judge, an austere man in a dark suit and measured voice, entered the room holding a stack of papers, which he placed on the bench with a slow, almost theatrical motion. It was as if he already knew this case had more layers than it let on, and it did. The hearing began formally. Marina, with the same confidence she had when she showed up at my door with her rental lawyer, repeated her story that the house had been given as a wedding gift, that she had signed documents, including the supposed power of attorney, and that I, because of my age, had simply forgotten the decisions I'd made. Rodrigo nodded along, never lifting his eyes. The judge then called for silence and said, "Now, let's hear from you, sir." I stood up slowly. No rush. I opened my old leather briefcase, the same one I used back when I worked at the courthouse as a clerk. The irony almost made me smile. I pulled out 3 documents with recent stamps, a flash drive, and 2 notarized copies of the house deed. The judge took them, read attentively, furrowed his brow, and looked at Marina the way one looks after finding a name in a book of wrongdoers. "Can you explain to us, calmly, exactly what you're claiming?" he asked. I simply said, "Your Honor, this house was never transferred. The deed was never altered. This supposed power of attorney is a forgery. My signature was copied from an old document, which I have here for comparison. Furthermore, I have recordings of Miss Marina and Mr. Rodrigo discussing how to force me out of the property, and then I handed over the flash drive. The judge ordered the audio to be played. The courtroom filled with Marina's voice. "He's old. He won't resist. We'll send him to a nursing home and that's that." Rodrigo's hesitant voice followed. "Are you sure this will work?" She snapped back. "No one checks deeds. I already had the lawyer forge it. By the time they notice, we'll have sold it." The silence in the room was total. Marina's breathing quickened. Rodrigo's face drained of color. "Miss Marina," the judge said, "do you confirm these statements?" She tried to smile, claiming it was all a misunderstanding, that the words had been spoken in the heat of the moment. The judge did not smile. On the contrary, he asked the officers present to take note and forward the material to the public prosecutor's office. The so-called power of attorney was seized and sent for handwriting analysis. There was already a preliminary expert report stating that the signature did not match mine in any way. That's when the judge read aloud the clause from the deed they had so brazenly ignored. Exclusive ownership with a lifetime inalienability clause, prohibiting sale or transfer without the express consent of the owner. And he concluded, therefore, no sale, donation, or transfer agreement holds any legal validity. Marina stiffened. Rodrigo closed his eyes. I just took a deep breath. The ruling was clear and immediate. All attempts to alienate the property were annulled. The judge also ordered the freezing of their assets until the investigation into fraud and identity falsification was complete. It was then that Marina finally dropped her act. She began crying softly, saying she just wanted a home to raise her children in peace. The judge didn't reply. He simply wrote something in his notebook and asked that officials register the attempted family fraud. Outside the courthouse, the local press was already waiting. Someone had leaked the contents of the recording, and a reporter asked me how it felt to win against a scam from within your own family. I replied with something I learned from my father. Betrayal inside the home is like termites in the foundation. By the time you notice, the floor's already giving way, and I walked away. There was no celebration that day, only relief. I returned to my home with the same light backpack I had taken to court. The house was still standing, but now, more than ever, it was a symbol of what I built with my own hands and what I defended with clarity until the end. I didn't have to shout. I didn't have to force anyone out. I just let the truth do its job, brick by brick. What began as a simple request to leave my own home turned into something I never expected, a headline. It was the morning after the hearing that everything blew up. The first news appeared quietly on a local journalism website. Elderly man accuses daughter-in-law and son of attempted real estate scam. A small headline, a stock photo, and a generic article. But it was enough to grab attention, because the next day, the same news was picked up by a bigger portal with my name this time. And the headline read, 72-year-old man records his own son and daughter-in-law trying to take his house using forged documents. From there, it never stopped. I received messages from neighbors, old co-workers, even folks at the corner store I'd been visiting for 20 years. Some wanted to know if it was true. Others just congratulated me for not backing down. Some asked if they needed to sign petitions, or if I needed help with a lawyer. But the most surprising call came from the principal of my grandson's school. He spoke softly, saying he'd received calls from parents concerned about the family's reputation and the possible influence the situation might have on their children. I stayed silent. I just thanked him. I never wished for this, but I never stopped it either. Rodrigo and Marina began feeling the weight of exposure almost immediately. First, it was on social media. Wedding posts, new life announcements, family fresh start photos all started receiving harsh comments. Scammers. How can you sleep at night? This is what happens when you mess with a house that's not yours. Then came real life. Consequences. Marina was called in for a surprise meeting at the accounting office where she worked. The following week, her position was discontinued. They said it was a budget cut, but we all knew what it really meant. Rodrigo, who worked as a freelance consultant, lost 2 contracts in less than a week. One client bluntly said, "I don't trust having you in my company anymore." What surprised me the most was how silent they became. No response videos, no open letters, no attempts to explain themselves. Just the awkward silence of those who know they've been exposed not only legally, but in the eyes of the whole town. Because here, everyone knows everyone, and everyone knew who built that house, who dug the first meter of foundation with a shovel in hand, who spent 3 years building it, brick by brick, on weekends. And suddenly, all that effort was reduced to an attempt to erase it with a forged signature. At the bakery, the owner gave me an extra sweet roll for courage. At the bus stop, a lady called me an example of dignity. A group of students stopped me at the park and said they would use my case for a school project on family ethics. And each of those moments reminded me of that afternoon when I sat on the living room floor, fixing the refrigerator with a screwdriver, while Marina told me my house had been sold. I know many expected me to feel satisfaction in seeing them exposed, but it wasn't satisfaction I felt. It was sadness. Sadness because the blood of my blood had chosen the shortest, coldest, ugliest path. And because, despite everything, I was still a father, still a father-in-law, still someone who remembered the day I carried Rodrigo on my shoulders on a sunny Sunday, unaware that decades later he would try to take my roof from me. There was one moment I can't forget. It was at the supermarket. I ran into Marina's mother. She looked at me with a mix of shame and compassion. She said, "I'm sorry. She wasn't raised for this." I simply replied, "The fault isn't only with those who fail. It's also with those who stay silent." She looked down, and we went separate ways down the rice aisle. At the end of that month, I received a simple letter in a white envelope. It was from an NGO that helps elderly victims of patrimonial abuse. They said my case had inspired a new campaign. They asked for permission to use my name. I granted it, and for the first time in years, I felt that maybe my pain served a greater purpose. I didn't just reclaim my house. I reclaimed my voice and my story. And every person who read that headline, everyone who saw my face in the local newspaper, didn't see a grumpy old man defending property, but someone who refused to be discarded for convenience. And that's why, that same night, I sat on my porch with a hot cup of coffee in my hands, watching the sky darken. The gate was closed, the lights were on, and for the first time in a long time, everything was in its place. They came at the end of a gray afternoon, with the same silence you feel when entering an empty church. The gate of my house still bore the sign, "Not for sale," not even by betrayal. But they entered anyway. They didn't ring the bell, just slowly opened the gate and stood on the porch, side by side, like two strangers waiting for a ride that would never come. Marina's hair was tied back, her eyes sunken, no makeup. Rodrigo had a scruffy beard and a downcast gaze, as if searching the ground for an excuse for what he had done. I saw them through the curtain but kept watering the plants. I knew time now obeyed me, not their anxiety. After a few minutes of awkward silence, I went to the door. I said nothing, just looked, and they began to speak. The phrases were rehearsed but broken. "Dad, we were wrong. It was a lot of pressure. We didn't know it would be like this. We were badly advised." Marina said it was the lawyer's idea. Rodrigo said he just signed without really understanding. But I wasn't listening to the words. I heard the tone of those who only came because they had lost everything. I didn't see remorse there. I saw despair, the same attempt to control, only now dressed as regret. Marina cried. Rodrigo tried to hold her hand, but she pulled away. Maybe they were no longer accomplices. Maybe they had discovered, in the eye of public humiliation, that they had been alone from the start. She asked for forgiveness, said she missed the Sunday lunches, the times when I called her daughter. Rodrigo said he missed childhood, the times I took him fishing. It was beautiful and belated, because when you dig a grave with the shovel of greed, the sound of regret echoes too late. I asked them to sit on the porch, made coffee, served it like I used to, carefully, with sugar on the side, and the same embroidered little cloth Marina gave me on her first Christmas as my daughter-in-law. While they drank, I told a story I had never told before. I told them about when I almost lost the house in the 90s because of a friend's debt, for which I was a guarantor. About how I spent 2 years saving every last penny to recover what was mine. About how I even slept on a foam mattress on cold cement just to not lose the little dignity I had left. Then I asked, "Did you think I was a fool?" They exchanged looks, silent. I continued. Did you think I would give it all up because I lack teeth? Because my step is slower? Because I speak little? Marina lowered her head. Rodrigo tried to answer, but I raised my hand. I didn't want excuses. I wanted them to listen, to feel the weight of what they almost did. I said I didn't hate either of them, but forgiveness, for me, was like fixing the house. It only works if those who broke it help rebuild it. And there, before me, I saw no will to fix, only the fear of having nowhere to go. They asked for a second chance, said they could help with expenses, that they were willing to start over. But I had already started over, and alone. Help with what? Exactly. The water bills they never paid. The taxes they never cared to check if we're up to date. The mornings they pretended I was invisible just because my voice was no longer in fashion. I slowly stood up, collected the cups, and thanked them for the visit. Said the coffee was good, and that their silence, the one that preceded the betrayal, was more cruel than the attempt to steal. I said when a house is made of concrete, it withstands storms. But when those living inside try to demolish the foundation, the crack isn't in the wall, it's in the affection. They left without saying another word, walked together to the gate but each in their own silence. And there I stood at the door, feeling no victory. I felt that justice, sometimes, comes disguised as solitude, but it is a dignified solitude, because when you are betrayed inside your own home, forgiveness doesn't come from the mouth. It comes, if it comes at all, from the rebuilding within. And that's not something just anyone knows how to do. The morning after their visit, the sun hit my gate differently. Not that there was any change in the sky or the temperature. It was the same sun as always, but now I found a house whose walls no longer trembled from within. A house that, after so long being just a home in a backdrop, was becoming a shelter once again. There was silence, yes, but it was a clean silence. A silence that didn't hide conspiracy, pain, or humiliation. It was a silence I had chosen myself, and it was in that silence that I made a decision. I went to the neighborhood carpenter's shop. I asked for a wooden sign, simple but firm. I wanted big letters, dark varnish, white background, letters of someone who doesn't ask but states. Letters of someone who had explained too much before and now preferred to make everything clear right at the door. On the paper, I wrote with my tired but determined handwriting, "This house is not for sale, nor for betrayal." The young man at the workshop looked at me for a few seconds, maybe expecting me to laugh, to say it was a joke, but I just signed and paid up front. While the sign was being made, I spent the days painting the walls. I sanded the front wall, changed the door lock, bathed the dog, and even bought new plants for the porch. Each gesture was small, but together they formed something bigger, a ritual of reclaiming. It wasn't a new house. It was my house becoming mine again, not just on paper. It always was, but in spirit. It had started to breathe again, along with me. The sign arrived on a Friday, late afternoon. The young man delivered it carefully, wrapped in cardboard. The wood was smooth, smelling of workshop and freshly cut dignity. I installed it myself, with the hands that built this place years ago, hammering slowly, like signing a final letter. When I finished, I stepped back and looked. It was beautiful, and just a short phrase, and the whole story was there. It didn't take long to draw attention. The next day, the neighbor from number 38 slowly passed by with her shopping cart, read it aloud, and said, "Good one, Mr. Augusto." I just smiled. A teenager on a bike slowed down and chuckled respectfully. A rideshare driver came to pick someone up and, when stopping the car, rolled down the window and said, "That phrase should be in more places, you know?" And I understood. It wasn't just about my house. It was about the boundary between what is ours by right and what will never belong to anyone through deceit. The following days were calm. Rodrigo and Marina never came back. No letters, no calls, Maybe they understood, maybe not, but it no longer mattered. I no longer needed their presence to validate who I was, nor their absence to justify my pain. I had done what I needed to do, protected what I built with hard work, sleepless nights, sacrifices nobody saw, and not out of revenge but out of respect. The kind of respect no one gives you if you don't put up a sign yourself and say, "Here's where you don't step." Sometimes I stand on the porch with my coffee and stare at the sign, and I think of all it carries: the rush of the wedding, the twisted look of the daughter-in-law, the lawyer knocking on the door with fake papers, the silence of my son, the cold laughter, the attempt to tear me away from my own story, as if I were an obstacle, as if old age meant uselessness. But then I see the sign, and all that dissolves, because I know I wasn't defeated. I know I wasn't taken away. I know that no matter how hard they try, the house only belongs to them if the owner loses himself. And I found myself again just in time. The sign is still there today. Some take pictures, others make jokes. Some don't understand. But those who have been betrayed inside their own walls know. They know that sometimes what keeps a house standing isn't the cement or the brick. It's the warning at the entrance. Not for sale, nor for disrespect, nor for imposed loneliness, nor for betrayal. And if someday I leave, by age, by fate, by nature, I want that sign to remain. Because it doesn't just speak about me. It speaks about all who have grown old building a home and, in the end, still need to fight to stay in it. But I fought, and I won. With silence, with dignity, with wood, paint, and a phrase worth more than any document.